Hi, I'm Brian Phillips with the Texas Institute for Property Rights. Welcome to our mini-course, Why Precise Thinking Matters. When it comes to communication, clarity is king. If we want to effectively communicate our thoughts and ideas, then we must make our meaning clear, and we do this by being precise. It's often said that muddy waters appear deep. If we're looking at a body of water that is muddy, we can't tell how deep it is. It might be safe to jump in, or it might be dangerous. We don't know what's lurking below the surface. And the same is true of muddy thinking. We don't know what the meaning is. We don't know if the ideas are safe or dangerous because we aren't clear on what they actually mean. Muddy thinking occurs in a couple of ways, or a couple of ways are predominant. One is sloppy thinking, and we'll talk about that a little more depth in a moment. And a second way is cliches and bromides, which we'll also look at in more depth. But the danger with this muddy thinking is that premises can be snuck into an argument or a discussion. If we aren't clear on what's being said, then the opponent might sneak in ideas that on the surface might seem safe or even appealing, but they are really dangerous or nefarious. So muddy thinking just clouds the issue. We aren't clear on what the other person's saying, and so we aren't clear on what their real meaning is. Now, very few people openly support fuzzy, imprecise thinking, but that doesn't mean that precise thinking is common. So why is precision important? Precision makes our thinking clearer. It makes it easier for us to understand what is being said, and makes it easier for us to communicate what we mean. Precision helps make our premises more explicit and helps us make the premises of our opponents on an issue more explicit. And so this leads to better decisions. When we are more precise in our words and what others mean, the choices that we are facing become much clearer. It becomes much more black and white, and often it's very black and white instead of gray. When thinking and speaking and writing is done imprecisely, we are faced with not a black and white choice, but this large murky area of gray. So precision helps us avoid that and helps make the choices that we are facing much more clear. It differentiates the choices by separating them into black and white rather than a large blob of gray. Sloppy thinking can occur in a number of different ways. One common way is through misrepresentation. When this occurs, facts are presented in a misleading way, and so the audience draws a conclusion based on this slanting or bias of the facts. And Uber is a good example of this. Opponents of Uber often like to argue that Uber is a taxi company and therefore should be subject to the same rules and regulations as taxi companies. But if we're precise in our thinking and the words that we use, we will identify the fact that Uber itself is not a taxi company. It's a service, a ride-sharing service that connects those who have a vehicle with those who want to hire that vehicle for transportation. So this may seem like it's splitting hairs because there are a lot of similarities between Uber and taxi companies, but there are significant differences as well. And if we want to be precise in our thinking, then we have to recognize these differences. Otherwise, we might draw the wrong conclusions and make the wrong choices in regard to Uber and other ride-sharing companies. Another way sloppy thinking occurs is through exaggeration. This occurs when the extent of a problem is exaggerated, where perhaps there's a problem that occurs rarely or not very often, but individuals present the problem as if it's occurring continuously or constantly or all of the time. And short-term rentals are a good example of this. Opponents of short-term rentals portray the practice as nothing more than a bunch of landlords who are operating party houses. And a party house is where a renter throws a party, a loud, boisterous party that disrupts the neighborhood and causes all kinds of problems. And the opponents of short-term rentals often like to portray the practice as nothing more than the operation of party houses, when in fact, party houses are very rare. So they're presenting an exception, which is the party house, as if it's the rule, and they're exaggerating the problem. A third way in which sloppy thinking occurs is through equivocation. And when this occurs, a word is used with two different meanings or in two different ways. The word investment is an example. Government officials often like to talk about using tax money as an investment, maybe in a new technology or something of that nature. But there's a world of difference between using tax dollars to provide subsidies for a business and the types of investments that occur in the private sector. In the private sector, an investment occurs when an individual believes that he will receive a suitable return on his investment and make a profit. I mean, that's what he's trying to do. But when government officials or their advocates talk about investment, what's really occurring is money is taken from taxpayers without their consent for a use that they may or may not agree with. So the word investment is being used in two very different ways. Another example of imprecise thinking is the use of cliches and bromides. And these are terms that are often overused. They're thrown out like candy on Halloween. But they generally have vague or fuzzy meanings. Nobody's really clear on what they mean. And people will use these terms without bothering to define them or identify what they mean, or attempt to. And these cliches and bromides often sound appealing, and this works to the advantage of those who would violate property rights. They use terms like quality of life or heritage or public interest, all of which may sound appealing, but are very, very difficult to define and maybe even impossible to define. And so that works to the advantage of those who would violate property rights. For example, improving quality of life is often used as a justification for property rights violations, zoning and other land use regulations. But what does quality of life mean? It means something different to each individual. We each define quality of life very differently. Some people like baseball, some people like the ballet, some like both. Some prefer quiet walks in the park, while others prefer strolling around the mall. We each want different things for our lives and value different things, and so we define quality of life very differently. But those who use this term imply that we all share the same definition of quality of life, and therefore that justifies their policies and violations of property rights. But if we look below the surface and try to identify what these terms really mean, we'll find that often there is no definition, or there is a definition that is essentially different for each individual, or at least how we apply that idea is different for each individual. So how do we establish precision in a discussion? the best way is to demand definitions. If somebody uses a term, we should require them to define that term, to be clear about what it means. For example, with quality of life, if someone uses quality of life as a justification for a policy, we should demand that they define quality of life rather than allowing them to throw that cliche out and think that everybody understands and agrees with what they mean. We can really put them on the spot and illustrate the fact that it is a fuzzy term, that it's very difficult for them to define it, and when we do that, we can expose the principles and the premises that underlie their policy and their position. For example, if we require them to define quality of life, we can then point out that each individual defines it differently. The quality of life means something different for each individual. And those who would violate property rights are attempting to impose their definition of quality of life on everyone else. So when we demand precision and require it in our discussions and communications, we can expose our opponents for what they are really attempting to do. Precision can be a great tool in differentiating our position from our opponents. Precision builds credibility. We aren't hiding our meaning. We are very clear and explicit about what we are trying to communicate. And this can be a stark contrast to our opponents who are using cliches that they can't or won't define and hiding their premises. We also set a higher standard. If we are being precise in defining our terms and being very clear about what we mean, then our opponents are going to be put in a position where they need to do that, or they will be exposed for not really understanding what they are trying to express, the ideas that underlie their policies and positions, and they will look like they're trying to hide something, which in fact they are doing. Precision creates greater understanding, both for ourselves and for those we're trying to persuade. It brings greater clarity to the issue. Those that we are trying to persuade can see the difference between our approach and our ideas and the clarity and precision we bring to them, and the lack of precision and clarity on the part of our opponents. It makes us look more open and honest, which in fact, that's what we are doing. We are more open and honest because we're not trying to hide anything. We're saying, here are the ideas that we advocate, and these are dramatically different from our opponents. Consider, we're speaking to an audience or trying to convince others of our position, and they see this difference between those defending property rights and those who would violate property rights, and that's a very powerful position to be in. They can see that the dramatic difference between the two methodologies. One side is easy to understand and open about the ideas that are involved, and the other side is unable to define their terms. They're hiding their ideas, and that certainly creates questions about the motivations of those who would violate property rights. Precision works to the advantage of those who are advocating the rational.